Hi, everybody. I'm Lee Holmes. I'm the lead security architect of Azure Management. And so we have PowerShell, OMS, Azure Backup, bunch of cool technologies like that. Today, we're going to talk about defending against PowerShell attacks. There's been a lot of discussion about PowerShell and security in the news. And then the big question is, what can I do to defend against these kind of attacks? So the first thing we're going to talk about is kind of head into the abyss a little bit. What do PowerShell attacks look like, and what can we do about them? Now, realistically, people are getting compromised through a bunch of things. Phishing emails, document macros, malicious website links, things like that. Here's an example of what honestly, most attacks end up looking like. So this is an Office document with a malicious macro. It's really common to blame the phishing victims, and this is a thing that I really want to discourage. I've talked with customers who had attackers make it into one of their subsidiaries. The attacker then responded to an active email thread and attached one of these phishing documents. And no matter how good your spidey senses are, that thing is going to get you every single time. So this is what a traditional Office document looks like when you get one of these. A bunch of these screenshots are from John Lambert on Twitter. He's a great person to follow if you're not already. Now, what happens when you enable macros there, this is what a very simple stager looks like in a macro. You see here VBA. It's a fully fledged programming language. Not a lot of people like it, but it works. You see at the very top, it's got full access to the Windows API. And in this situation, what this macro is doing is it's using the Windows API to download just a regular exe and run it. So this is a very typical stager. And at that point, once they download basically the real malware, that's when you start getting the attack happening. The important point to note here is that VBA itself, being a fully fledged programming language, it can do anything that the operating system can do. I've seen a VBA macro written that literally implemented the full depth of a PE loader. You know, everything that Windows does to take a DLL and turn it into executable code in memory, that's been done in VBA. So if you can dream it, it can be done. At this point, it's game over if this thing's running on your system. Now here's what you'll also see often. So that VBA macro you saw before, what it does is it downloads an exe. Now here's an example where that exe is embedded into the macro itself. It's been base64 encoded and goes through some shenanigans, decodes the base64, writes it into an executable on disk, and runs that executable. So there's kind of a bit more advanced macro, but it's still basically doing the same thing. This might look familiar. This is when you start talking about a PowerShell attack. It's still really the same VBA. It's doing some base64 decoding, but then rather than write an exe, it's either writing a PowerShell script or invoking a bit of PowerShell itself. The thing to remember here is that this is still written in VBA, and it's got full access to everything that could possibly have happened. So at this point, PowerShell is being used as part of a tool chain, but it's incidental to the actual power or capability. Now you might wonder, that looked like a pretty plain vanilla macro. Maybe that's the basics. What does an APT look like? There's a great blog post from FireEye that really digs down into a bunch of APT work. And if you take a look at some of the stuff that these things start with, you know, if you've seen one, you've really seen them all. This specific APT ended up being just another example of a macro that downloaded an exe and ran it. So you do get kind of jaded at seeing these attacks after a while, but that's what happens. Palo Alto, they have a Unit 42, and they did a really great blog post a while ago. And they really started to take a look at what does it really mean when you've got a PowerShell attack. They run a email filtering gateway, and they did a bunch of deep analysis of when they had uncovered an attack. So this was ultimately somebody using, for example, PowerShell-encoded command. So when some portion of the attack itself used PowerShell, they went and finally root caused that, and that's something you very rarely see in the industry. Turns out, of the investigation that they did, they weren't really PowerShell attacks. As you can see, what started was somebody actually running an executable, or a document with a macro, or a spreadsheet with a macro, or a DLL. So all of these PowerShell attacks were really just exe attacks, or document attacks, or x86 attacks. They're just plain vanilla code running on the system, and at some point the attacker decided, my life is boring, I want to use PowerShell instead. Now, one thing that you have seen, though, is a great improvement, kind of in a rich ecosystem developing of PowerShell for post-exploitation toolkits. So the core thing to remember here is that this is all about post-exploitation. By the time that any of these toolkits run, so the social engineer toolkit, or Empire, or PS attack, anything like that, when you see any of these run, the attacker had full, unrestricted administrative access to the computer that they're on. There has never been PowerShell as the initial point of entry. As I pointed out before, it was they're already running from an executable, or a DLL, or a macro that can implement the Windows PE loader subsystem if they wanted to. So that's kind of the core there. Now, the reason that these penetration testers love these post-exploitation toolkits is the same reason that administrators love it. PowerShell is a fun language. It makes you feel powerful. It adds variety and spice to your day-to-day life. And so you've seen this great blossoming of these toolkits. When it really comes down to it, though, these toolkits that are depending on PowerShell, there's a lot of other stuff that they can do on these machines. If you think from in your head, what could you do as an attacker once you've already compromised a machine and you wanted to do other things? There's a ton of opportunities you have, right? You've got, if it's a Unix machine, you've got Perl, Python, Bash, Windows, you've got DLLs and load path tampering, COM objects. Hey, CSC is on the box. On Linux, you've got the compilers on the box. You can compile your new applications. You can use PowerShell, SQL, HTML applications, pretty much anything. Once you're on a box, Chris talked about living on the land a little bit. There's a ton of things you can do. But that's just a sampling. The MITRE Corporation organization has done a great job at enumerating some of this stuff, right? So it turns out that it's not just all about post-exploitation. That's a pretty broad term. Once you start getting into post-exploitation, you have things like, what are you doing for discovery and enumeration, accessing credentials? How are you detecting what defense is on the system? What do you do for actual invocation of your attacks? So this is some of the techniques that they've enumerated for Windows. They've got a similar matrix like this for Unix-based systems and Mac. As you can see, there's a ton of techniques that attackers have and that they leverage every single day. But what you hear, though, is realistically, with so many people being compromised with just plain vanilla executables, antivirus vendors are having a really hard time catching up with and getting any sort of media play that, hey, yeah, we had another executable attack that we blocked. So there's a lot of people trying to kind of prove their importance by how well they understand PowerShell attacks. So naturally, people start hearing about the PowerShell attacks and say, well, hey, let's block PowerShell then. But here's the problem. That's not really effective. I showed you all the things that people can do on a system. Blocking PowerShell itself is such a not even a roadblock for anybody. People have been successful with attacking systems before PowerShell was invented, and they're going to continue to be successful attacking system when PowerShell's not there. Blocking PowerShell doesn't address the underlying security problem. And what's most important is that it removes your most secure and security transparent management tool. So what do I mean by a security transparent management tool? Oh, wait, don't forget, if you block PowerShell, it's not just PowerShell.exe. PowerShell is an automation engine. You can use PowerShell from pretty much any executable. A couple of the frameworks that you see out there, they are leveraging the underlying, it's called system management automation. They're leveraging the underlying automation framework, and they're not just hosting it from PowerShell.exe. So people that block PowerShell.exe still have a massive opportunity and a massive risk from things like the ISE or any of these toolkits that leverage the automation engine. If you block PowerShell attacks, this is literally what you've done. So take a look at this MITRE attack framework. If you block PowerShell remoting completely and PowerShell and even the whole automation engine completely, you take out 2 little blocks out of all of this. That's not going to prevent many attackers, as it should be pretty clear here. Here's another example. Once we're talking about the full scope of things, I expect you to read this and understand every little bit of it. This is an example of all of the things that embed the Lua scripting language. Lua is a very popular scripting language and is very capable. It's embedded in a ton of things. Here's an example of popping calc from using the version of Lua embedded in Nmap. And Nmap is a very, very capable network mapping tool. It's deployed and installed everywhere across enterprises and networks usually. Here's an example of how risky that is. The way to think about this, when people start going down the path of just blocking PowerShell attacks, mature security organization and a mature security response realizes that security is really 3 things. You've got preventing a breach, you've got detecting a breach, and you have remediating a breach. When you start talking about, hey, I heard about PowerShell attacks, let's block PowerShell, what you said is that I had all this muscle behind prevention in terms of, let's say, the Word document or whatever. That didn't work. I'm going to invest more in prevention. Sometimes that works and sometimes that's helpful. The other big thing, though, is detection. When somebody is breached, more often than not, the attacker stays in their network for, let's say, a year. That proves that they had incredible lack of muscle on detection. And usually the remediation effort is left to, you call in the big boys and the big girls, and they go off and fix your network. But there's a huge opportunity here to really start to think about detection. A great example of this was, my favorite example is from Mandiant. They had a situation with a customer. They've described this in a presentation called No Easy Breach. You can look it up on YouTube. I just love to watch it. So they had a customer that was being compromised by APT29. So this is a government actor. This government actor was in this customer, compromising systems basically as fast as they could be remediated. They were using kind of everything that they could find. They were using PowerShell, they were using Python, they were using batch files, just whatever was available, they were using it and just rolling this customer. This was one of the most challenging incident responses that Mandiant had been in, and they did one thing. The one thing that they did was they introduced and they deployed a new version of PowerShell, and this was PowerShell version 4 that we introduced a bunch of the new logging stuff. They deployed this new version of PowerShell, cranked all the logging, and this crazy mysterious breach now became immediately open source. Everything the attackers were doing, every credential that they were using, every system that they were connecting to, every command that they ran was now completely in the open. And this became the nut that they were able to finally crack exactly what was happening on these systems. And then from then, it really unraveled the investigation, and they were able to remediate it shortly after. So there's an example of building a detective muscle and a detection muscle and a remediation muscle that literally by one thing of installing a new version of PowerShell with enhanced auditing and logging managed to finally break this nut. So it might sound like, I've been spending a lot of time talking about some context here, and it might sound like we're a bit of a apologist mode here of like, hey, don't block PowerShell. It's not going to do what you need. But the reality is there's a real world out there. Attackers are using PowerShell, and we've been listening. This is a snapshot from a blog post that we put up that kind of goes into the security features that we built into PowerShell itself. And we've been doing this since the very invention of PowerShell. We're on to 11 years now since PowerShell was released, and PowerShell is by far the most secure and security transparent scripting or automation or command shell that exists out there. Now, there's kind of an interesting change, though. We've been working with the Python community to bring some of this stuff to Python itself. So there's the Python PEP processes out there. You can take a look. There's one that talks about adding security transparency to the Python runtime, and they're working on bringing on event logging, dynamic evaluation logging, and a couple other things. So watch this space. Things are getting really interesting. But who knows? In the next year, you might see PowerShell and Python as these two great examples of automation languages and application languages that you can really trust to use to their full benefit while still offering full security transparency from the remediation and response perspective. Now let's talk about what things you can do to actually start to lock down your systems using some PowerShell-based security functionality. So what are the things that you actually do to start defending against these PowerShell attacks? Now, the first thing that you can do is start to change some of your architectures themselves. One major problem that people have is kind of unconstrained administration through their system. They have tons and tons of domain admins, and if they're not domain admins, maybe they're admins over tons and tons of systems. It's kind of a problem. So we'll talk through something that we've added called Just Enough Administration that really does a great job and makes it very, very easy to lock down what people can do on your systems. So for this scenario, the person at the top left is Benjamin Delphi. He's the author of Mimikatz. He's not literally attacking systems. He's a great guy, and he's explicitly approved being used in this presentation. So no slam on him. He's kind of a persona here. So imagine Benjamin Delphi is your DNS administrator. He tries to, RDP into a server, and he gets an access denied. Now in our other corner, we have our hero and knight in shining armor, Jeffrey Snover, and he's like, hey, Jeffrey, I'm your DNS admin. Let me into server 1. I need to restart the DNS server. And Jeffrey, he wasn't born yesterday. He says, no. Connect using PowerShell to connect to the server. So Benjamin connects up. He's able to restart the DNS service. Hey, things are good. He gets his job done. Jeffrey looks away for 1 minute. He tries to start stealing some secrets. He gets an error, of course. Jeffrey, again, not being born yesterday, did not authorize him to steal secrets. This would be pretty sweet if this thing existed, right? It does. The way to think about it is that your security exposure on a system is a combination of two things. It's the time at which somebody has administrative access and the capability that they have while they're accessing that system. We've been doing a really good job as an industry starting to restrict this time band. We call it privileged identity management or a couple different things, but it's the idea that you're a just-in-time admin, you have access while you need to do your job, but then magical subsystems remove your administrative access outside of that. Just enough administration is all about the capability. What is the capability that you have while you're accessing the system? Should you be able to run Mimikatz? Probably not. Should you be able to restart the DNS server? Yeah, probably. So this is what it looks like to actually configure JEA on a system. So this is one of the main things that JEA is broken into is something called role capabilities. This is literally an example of what it looks like. The description is optional. You got an example of importing the DNS server module. And all you're exposing is a couple commandlets that this person needs to do their job. There's also a function definitions area where you can start to expose custom code where a built-in commandlet didn't get the job done, or maybe it exposed some functionality that you didn't want to do. So these are really, really simple to write. You can also do this just enough administration locally. So here's an example of how to configure local sandboxing. It's a simple registry key that will set the JEA endpoint that anybody connects to when they use the local instance of PowerShell. So this is a useful thing to do on jump boxes, for example, when you want to restrict the list of commands that somebody has access to. So when you combine those two things, time and capability, you see that your security exposure at this point is this intersection of time and capability, and then you can restrict the danger of a compromised account or a compromised credential to just a super small portion of what used to be possible. So that's JEA. The other big thing that I've been talking about is PowerShell and the eternal quest that we've had for making PowerShell security transparent. The big thing to realize here is that when a machine has been compromised, it's not game over. When a machine is compromised, an attacker has not yet accomplished their goal, right? All they've done is they've got code execution, but they're ultimately looking for secrets or data exfiltration or something else. When you have security transparent tooling at your disposal, you still have a lot of opportunity before they've actually accomplished their goal. This is the whole kill chain model that PowerShell does a really great job at giving you power in that regard. The way to configure these things are PowerShell has a ton of group policies for this. They're also backed by regular registry keys. So any way that you configure your systems, either through desired state configuration or group policies or just direct registry manipulation will work. Now the first part is module and pipeline logging. Module and pipeline logging goes through it shows all of the commandlets being run and all of the parameters being used to invoke these commandlets. So that's a really helpful thing. The next thing is system transcripts. This is basically an over-the-shoulder view of what's happening on a system. So if you had the wonderful privilege to sit behind an attacker as they were typing on your computer, this is what you would see. You would see their inputs, you would see their outputs, and this is what transcripting is. We have a great example. There's a blog post that we'll refer to at the end called PowerShell Hearts the Blue Team. One great technique is to set up transcript logging, have this automatically logged to a remote file share, and then you can restrict that file share so that nobody has read access to it or enumeration access to it. And this gives you a great perspective of what's happening on a system. And one thing to realize is you do not need to have amazing incident response skills. You do not need to have amazing PowerShell skills in order for this to have security benefit. This is like a flight data recorder in the very worst case. You set all these things up, and if a breach happens, you can have experts look at the logs where if you didn't have the expertise directly. So these things are very, very cheap and very rewarding to set up. So that was transcripting. Script block logging is a thing that's also super amazing. What you see pretty often is attackers using something like PowerShell-encoded command, and it's a bunch of base 64. Or they'll use something like obfuscation, where they'll run a script, it's very, very obfuscated. Maybe you're not going to have the chance to write any rules against that actual content. So here's an example where somebody has used some obfuscation, and that bit at the beginning is short form or long form for the invoke expression commandlet. So the invoke expression commandlet says, hey PowerShell, I've got a big string, and I want you to evaluate it at runtime. This is also really common with stagers, where the stager will have just a bit of basic PowerShell, and then it reaches out at runtime to a command and control server to get more PowerShell or something like that, and then also invoke it locally. But the big trick is that PowerShell script block logging, every time PowerShell is asked to invoke anything, it logs it. Once you've enabled PowerShell script block logging, this example turns to this example. This is completely deobfuscated, and you can see exactly what's happening. PowerShell script block logging is the best PowerShell deobfuscator a reverse engineer could ever hope for. Set up a VM, turn on script block logging, run the malicious code, and then just take a look at what happened in the PowerShell script block logs. No need to go back and forth over all these expressions. All you have to do is take a look at what the logs showed, and you know exactly what happened. This is exactly what was the capability that was really leading to the major opening of that no easy breach case. Now, this is what people start to look at when you're starting to talk about malware. One of the major problems in this industry is that antivirus vendors depend very heavily on signatures of known malware. Of course, almost every AV vendor also does behavior analysis and stuff, but a really huge part of most AV is signatures for known bad. But I showed you a little bit of that obfuscation before, where people can change just little things and break what the AV was previously using for a signature. When it comes to script-based malware, almost entirely it's of the form of some trivial outer layer escaping and obfuscation, leading to something like an eval or an invoke expression, which decrypts it or something like that, and then it's got a core payload it's usually unchanged. Now, if you can imagine, what would happen if PowerShell, that's amazing script block logs, if that was able to ask AV every single time, hey, antivirus, I was just asked to evaluate some new content. Is that still okay? Well, fortunately, it exists. Built into Windows 10, there's now the anti-malware scan interface. And this is what lets PowerShell and other applications become active members in their own defense. So no longer is this antivirus having to do everything to protect the system from itself and protect applications from themselves. Now PowerShell and VBScript and HTA and all these things can now opt in and call this anti-malware scan interface, and then any registered antivirus provider that's listening, so Defender listens, for example, and a couple others do, any of them at any point during this execution flow can say, no, I actually realize at this point you've gone through 3 stages of deobfuscation. Now I know for sure this is bad. And this is defending and protecting tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people every single month. Now, when you start to get into all of this event logging, you might start to worry a little about the information disclosure risks in your event log. So you might wonder or worry if an attacker gets onto that system and they look at the event log, might they get some secrets? Might they get some other things? This is also a very big danger with the command line logging, like the 4688 event log. PowerShell doesn't have this issue usually as bad as other systems because PowerShell from the start has always used the credential management techniques, so get credential and everything else. It's used that as a secrets management tool and also the secure string management tool. So in general in PowerShell, you're not going to see credentials laying around in logs, but you still might worry. And one of the things that PowerShell does add here is called protected event logging. Now, protected event logging builds on the magic of public and private key crypto, where what you do is with public and private key crypto, encryption is broken into two phases. One phase and one key is the encryption key, and that's completely separate than the key that can be used to decrypt the data. So the secret there, and the idea is you send out the public key to all of your nodes and all your machines and all your network. That's not a secret. Now, every machine, once this thing is deployed, and you can do this through group policy or through file shares, a couple different ways. Once you've configured protected event logging, you can then, PowerShell will automatically encrypt all of its event logs with this public key. Then you'll use something like WEF or something to forward these event logs to a collector. And that collector is a thing that you can secure much more carefully. And on that collector, you install the private key. And when you have access to the private key, you can decrypt it, get the original content, and then dump that into your SIM or run your tooling against that. This is a very, very powerful feature. I won't go into these deeply. There's a bunch of useful events that are great to monitor when it comes to PowerShell. The one thing, so the 4104 event, that's the PowerShell script block log. One of the things that PowerShell added when it added this was even if you haven't enabled PowerShell script block logging, if a script uses a technique that we commonly see in the wild that's commonly malicious, we're going to log it anyways. So they're what we've identified by investigating in the wild frameworks and everything else. If we see a technique like that, it gets logged anyways. And when we do this, this is the 4104 event, and we give it the warning level versus the verbose level. The important thing to remember and realize is that this is not the equivalent of an intrusion detection system. PowerShell is open source. Attackers have and can and will take a look at that source and realize how to write a script in such a way that it doesn't trigger this warning level. So this is not a substitute for enabling logging on a system. This is really a fail-safe or a stopgap. So if you've forgotten to enable it, there's still a chance that some of this stuff will be around in the PowerShell logs if it's kind of an off-the-shelf attack. So that's an important thing to remember, but also an important thing to realize is that if a system is compromised, there still might be some useful logs laying around that you can investigate. Now we started talking about post-processing event logs, right? So this is one of the things that I think there's a massive opportunity that's really not been leveraged that much. A great example of post-processing event logs is the detection of obfuscation itself. Here are two examples of scripts where what they've done is tried to obfuscate either just a standard download cradle or just for fun used only special characters in the evaluation of something. Now attackers do this to evade detection, but it turns out that by using this technique, they're actually just pointing a shining beacon at themselves that they are in your system. The thing is, these kind of scripts aren't normal. People don't write obfuscated stuff very often, and by looking for indicators of obfuscation, you now have a great way to start detecting whether you're under attack. So how might you do that? PowerShell, it turns out, has this mighty, mighty thing called the PowerShell AST. This is the abstract syntax tree, and this gives a tree-like representation of a PowerShell script. So you see here it can detect, hey, this is a command, this is a parameter, this is an expandable string. It gets very, very detailed. This is the only language aside from C# that I'm aware of that offers an API that gives you amazing access to the structure of a script itself. This is used very commonly in things like the ISE or Visual Studio Code, where you can do things like the syntax highlighting or refactoring and things like that. Now, one approach you might take to detect that obfuscated stuff is to go down the path of cosine similarity. So this is a cool technique that the information retrieval folks go down, which is taking a vector of numbers and comparing them and seeing how similar those numbers are. You might say, hey, I can take that technique and apply it to something like character frequency, where I'm going to go down and say that vector of numbers is how frequent is, A, E, I, O, U, all that kind of stuff. And you get a number. Turns out that's kind of fun to do. But an even better approach that Daniel Bohannon and I did as part of some work at Black Hat this year is to use a logistic regression. So a logistic regression is a much deeper approach that uses a lot of traditional statistic and mathematical techniques based on the abstract syntax tree structure itself. And it's amazing. If you take a look at what it can do, it gives you reliable obfuscation detection by just doing some analysis and running this revoke obfuscation module on one of your data collectors. So it ended up being a very, very juicy area of research and a great example of post-processing event logs. But when you really start going down the path of, now you've got a lot of maturity on prevention and detection and stuff, one of the things that's really, really powerful is how device guard plays in the PowerShell world. So PowerShell, device guard, application whitelisting. Once you start getting into the idea of I can block and detect known bad, a very, very strong approach is to say, let me think about this a different way. Let me restrict and allow. Let me allow all of the things that I know that I should run in my enterprise and block everything else. Now, that's not going to work very well if you say, I'm going to block literally everything. You're going to end up having a bunch of situations where some people use PowerShell a little bit. You don't want to either block them completely or allow them completely, and device guard and application whitelisting is the right way to do that. PowerShell, when it's on a system where application whitelisting is enabled, goes into a new mode called constrained language. So constrained language, what I'll show you here, take a look at this script at the very top. That's trusted.ps1. That's using some .NET scripting and some cool stuff. Imagine that as an example of a script that you might want your IT staff to be able to run or your incident response staff to be able to run. That first line you see, a user can run that thing. So imagine that that script has been allowed by your application whitelisting policy. Scripts that are allowed can run with full access to the PowerShell language. However, interactively, somebody tries to do something like that second line, maybe read some bytes of memory, something like that. When application whitelisting is enabled, that's blocked. Access to the .NET framework is blocked. There's a bunch of sensitive commandlets that are blocked. So you're good. So somebody thinking, oh, maybe I was able to run a script. Maybe I'll just put this into a script itself. So they try to put that exact same code into a script, and that's also going to be blocked. As long as you've set your application whitelisting policy up properly. So for example, is it signed by your IT certificate authority, something like that. App Locker and Device Guard have very rich policies that you can apply to PowerShell. Even if somebody is writing their own scripts, they're going to be able to do the basic stuff. So you're not completely limiting PowerShell. You're giving it kind of the functionality that you get anyways with just batch files. So you're allowed to do loops and some stuff like that, but you're not allowed to do the stuff that tends to be traditionally associated with an attack. So PowerShell does a great job on a device guard scenario. So I talked a little bit about the constrained language restrictions. We limit language elements that provide access to Win32 APIs and COM objects and some .NET stuff. The important thing to realize is that it's not a sandbox. If you give an attacker access to unrestricted access to cmd.exe, they're going to be able to do a lot of damage to that system. If you give an attacker access to a constrained language PowerShell prompt, they're going to be able to do a lot of damage to that system also, for example, calling format operator and stuff like that. So if you're wanting privileged sandboxing, you're really going to want to go down the path of just enough administration, including the local just enough administration. But constrained language does do an amazing job of limiting PowerShell to what you might consider the basics of system administration. Now, one of the things, when you start writing scripts as an IT organization that says, I'm going to let anybody run these scripts, but lock them down to constrained language themselves, one of the things to be careful about is secure coding. When you're either writing something with JEA or device guard that is built on this new attack surface now that you're giving yourself on these scripts, it's important to be aware of secure coding practices. Now, PowerShell, like almost every language, has the ability to say, PowerShell, run this arbitrary bit of code for me. And this arbitrary bit of code is in PowerShell called the invoke expression commandlet. So one mistake that people often make, here's an example of somebody who's trying to somehow limit the get process commandlet, and they ask the user for the name. If it's not literally PowerShell, then they throw an error. Otherwise, they do get process on that. One of the big issues there is that users aren't restricted to single words that you might be thinking. Just like SQL injection, they can do something like put a semicolon and then further statements. And because you asked PowerShell to invoke whatever you asked it to invoke, at that point an attacker is running get process dash name, PowerShell, semicolon, whatever. So you've got a code injection possibility there that would let an attacker elevate themselves from this constrained language to this full language. Now, PowerShell almost never needs you to use invoke expression in this way, and there's a bunch of techniques that you can do to never use invoke expression. Now, I talked about the AST a little bit ago, this great tree-like structure that represents every PowerShell script. Now, one really cool thing that we have in PowerShell is the method that lets you search through the AST based on some expressions or predicates. So you don't need to read all this, or don't need to understand it, but here's an example of finding all property accesses or member accesses. So for example, like string.equals or something. This lets you find any accesses that you have in your entire script where that property name is figured out at runtime rather than compile time. So that's kind of cool. Like that's kind of cool that you can do that. But you can also do this at scale. So PowerShell has this framework called the PowerShell Script Analyzer. And there are modules built in that are doing exactly this. They're using the AST to hunt through all kinds of stuff to find either bad coding practices or whatever. You can also do this for security issues. So one of the things that we're releasing very soon, and we'll be talking about it on the PowerShell blog, is the PowerShell Injection Hunter. So we've written a bunch of rules that dig through the ASTs. They work in the script analyzer to look for all kinds of unsafe coding practices. You can either run this directly against scripts to say, hey, here's some scripts that I know about. Do they have potentially any of these issues? You can run this, for example, against your JEA endpoints. You can run it against your scripts. You can run it against the stuff that you're allowing in device guard scenarios. Or with the cool work we've done in Visual Studio Code, you can just enable this as a module and get inline syntax highlighting when you're just about to do something bad. So here's the example I gave before, the unsafe escaping, where it will actually highlight that you're about to have an invoke expression injection issue. And what you thought you had done to protect against that also wasn't secure. So a super, super useful thing there. So great. You've deployed all this great stuff. PowerShell's done. You can button up your tie and you feel like you're doing a good job defending against PowerShell attacks. Just about. There is one aspect here to keep in mind, and that's a downgrade attack. We did all of this amazing stuff in PowerShell version 4 and version 5 that brought in great security functionality. The one issue and the one thing we weren't able to fix, though, was time travel. We could not fix things that were written in version 2. And so what people are starting to do in some attack frameworks is to explicitly leverage PowerShell version 2 whatever and use the PowerShell version 2 engine to do what they want to do rather than the version 5 engine that might be installed by default. Now, two ways to detect that. One is to look into the PowerShell log, the Windows PowerShell log. Event ID 400 shows every time the PowerShell engine starts. If you see that the engine version associated with PowerShell starting is less than version 5, that's something that you might want to investigate. You can also do this through file auditing or app blocker. The blog post I'll point out here is detecting and preventing PowerShell downgrade attacks. And it goes into some of the detection and prevention strategies where you can just literally block older versions of PowerShell.exe or uninstall it from your system and use an application whitelisting policy to prevent these downgrade attacks. Now, one of the things that I saw a lot this year at DEF CON, Black Hat, DerbyCon, from an attacker's perspective, there was this honeymoon phase that attackers were going through of like, PowerShell is amazingly powerful. AV really isn't paying attention to it. This is freedom. We are going to own the world. This is what was delivered instead. They got a honeypot. They got a trap. Today, in this year at the DerbyCon keynote, Matt Graber had a great point that the security transparency is so good on PowerShell that it's time to invest in other languages and frameworks that don't have this perspective. PowerShell has become the attacker's honeypot. Anybody who goes through any of this work for setting up PowerShell security with logging and everything else has turned their remediation and detection muscle as high as it can possibly go. So here's a bunch of references I would really recommend looking into. PowerShell Hearts the Blue Team is really the main place that goes into a lot of technical detail on these prevention and detection mechanisms. And there's a bunch of great resources out there. So thank you.